Greetings, y'all. Professor Hurley here with another cool conversation on anatomy and physiology. If you're new to the Purple Bear Biology channel, welcome, and I hope you will join our exploration by subscribing. Welcome back to the rest of you Purple Bears out there, and I hope that you're excited for today's episode. Today we get to explore circulation and respiration. In one of our previous episodes, we discussed digestion and the amazing system of surface area evolved to rapidly break down foods into usable cellular components. But what we didn't discuss was how those nutrients make it from where they get digested to all of the cells in the organism's body. And that's what we get to explore today. Much like with digestion, the simplest way to make sure you get nutrients and gases to all of your cells is to have each cell come in contact with the environment. One easy way to do this is to just be a single cellular organism. Direct transport across the membrane gives access to both essential nutrients, gases, and waste elimination. I find it really cool that really this is what happens even in multicellular organisms. The only real difference is the complexity of the transport system. When you have more cells, you need a method to get the necessities to all of those cells. One easy way to do this is to have every one of your cells come in contact with the environment for exchange. Organisms that are dorsoventrally flattened manage to accomplish gas exchange across their skin and transport nutrients from a branching gastrovascular cavity like the flatworm we see here. However, once multicellularity results in overall body volume increases, transport directly to the deepest internal cells becomes more challenging. In these scenarios, organisms have developed respiratory systems to exchange gases and circulatory systems to transport those same gases as well as nutrients to each of their cells. Some organisms perform respiration utilizing the same principle of transport as single-celled organisms' respiration, except they perform the gas exchange across specific regions of their skin. In these organisms, the gas exchange transports oxygen into adjacent circulatory systems that can then transport the necessary ingredients to the cells for respiration. This type of respiratory system would be referred to as an external respiratory system and draws the attention to two primary limitations of surfaces that we utilize for gas exchange. You see, respiration will only efficiently occur when a system provides a thin surface with lots of area for rapid diffusion and a moist surface to facilitate the gas diffusion across the membrane. The moisture requirement creates limitations that have striking implications on where these organisms can live. For example, both earthworms and frogs must maintain a moist skin surface for gas exchange. Because of this, both organisms have examples of mucosal glands that secrete fluid to keep the skin damp for gas exchange to occur. I should also mention that almost all amphibians actually also have lungs too, but their lungs pale in comparison to the more advanced systems designed for only internal respiration. Speaking of which, internal respiration occurs in a plethora of animal groups. This includes the most diverse animal group, insects, and of course, what we would be most familiar with is our own respiratory system. Insects have a remarkable tubular respiratory system that branches through structures called primary trachea down to smaller structures called tracheals. Air sacs inside of the insect help pump gases through the tubular branches, bringing air in and out of specialized openings called spiracles. These tiny openings are typically found on the thorax and abdomen of the insect. There's another cool fact embedded in there. This means that insects do not actually breathe through their mouths. This effectively means that in addition to all of the other awesome things about insects, they can completely submerge their heads underwater and breathe just fine. Regardless of the mechanism of internal respiration, the first huge benefit is that it enables organisms to dramatically reduce water loss through respiratory surfaces. Speaking of water loss, you might be wondering how organisms who actually live in the water breathe. Gills are arguably the most efficient respiratory system on the planet, and indeed, they have to be because of the environment. The average concentration of oxygen is 200% lower than that of free-floating air. With so little oxygen readily available, gills must maximize oxygen extraction. To do this, they utilize an amazing combination of anatomical surface area expansion through filaments and flowing of blood and water in opposite directions. Why flow blood and water in opposite directions, you ask? Well, that's a wonderful question, and the answer has to do with diffusion of gases. Fish respiration could accomplish gas exchange either by flowing blood and water in the same direction, called a concurrent flow, or flowing those two fluids in opposite directions, called a countercurrent flow. Unfortunately, if blood and water flow in the same direction, equilibrium is reached between the two environments, and no net movement of gases will occur after this has taken place. This limitation cannot exist in an environment with so little oxygen in the first place. Thus, instead, fish utilize a countercurrent exchange system, which results in gill blood always having a slightly lower concentration of oxygen compared to the water flowing by. This means equilibrium is never met, and gas exchange can occur across the entire gill vascular system. Now, I know where your next thought would go. If this system is so darn effective, then why do terrestrial organisms not have the same type of system? Well, the answer is twofold. First, the concentration of oxygen in the air is so ridiculously high relative to water, utilizing gills in the air would be overkill and a waste of developmental energy. Secondly, gills are very specialized for water. They are continuously surrounded by water. But if utilized in a terrestrial animal, then these same gills would collapse without structural support, as well as be a continuous location of water loss to the environment. So, if gills aren't the most efficient terrestrial respiratory system, then what is? Well, we would be hard-pressed to find one that beats those developed to fuel metabolic demands of flight. And birds stand as an excellent example. Birds actually have a system of lungs and air sacs to perform gas exchange as well as direct airflow. Airflow in birds is really cool because it is unidirectional, which is different from airflow in our lungs that is bidirectional. In our system, air flows in and out the same passage, and thus air mixes. This mixing of fresh and deoxygenated air means that there are limits to the amount of oxygen available at any given time inside of our lungs. Birds, however, have a respiratory system that allows fresh air to flow into the lungs with every breath and even when they exhale. With this type of system, they can maximize surface area and oxygen concentrations needed to sustain flight muscles for aerobic respiration. Now, our respiratory system is nowhere near as efficient as birds, but it's still an incredible system. Respiration in our bodies begins as air enters through our mouth or nasal cavity, and it takes a quick trip down past our trachea, down to branching tubes called bronchi. These bronchi branch into the left and right lungs. As air travels down those bronchi, they eventually narrow into smaller tubes called bronchioles that then terminate at alveolar sacs that are wrapped up in blood vessel capillaries from our circulatory system. The trip down to the point of gas exchange is driven by a negative pressure in our thorax as a primary muscle called the diaphragm contracts downward, creating more volume for air to rush into the lungs. Airflow is then reversed as the diaphragm relaxes and air gets pushed back out of the lungs. With all that air moving in and out of the respiratory system, the environment can really start to get gunked up. Particles like pollen and dust have a potential of covering gas exchange surfaces and reducing the efficiency of our lungs. Thus, priority number one of our branching bronchi is to house cells with tiny hairs called cilia for cleaning out our respiratory system. Collectively, the cells lining your respiratory passageways secrete mucus and capture debris from the environment. Once trapped, the cilia act like an escalator, pushing the mucus back up to the throat where it can get swallowed and goes down to the stomach. Once the oxygen enters the circulatory system, our blood transports the oxygen to the cells. It then picks up carbon dioxide to release back into the lungs for whenever we exhale air back out into the environment. We'll take a closer look at this circulatory system in just a second, but first I want to discuss the relative importance of the intricate passageway of gas exchange. You probably know that your cells need oxygen for cellular respiration, but the process of releasing carbon dioxide is actually just as important. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the blood can have a dynamic impact on the pH of the blood, and the pH of our tissues and fluids determines whether or not cellular proteins will function correctly. Of all of the cool and important things we talk about, protein function is one of the most important characteristics of our physiology, and thus it is tightly regulated. To monitor the pH of our tissues and blood, we have multiple sensors found in key areas of the body, mainly around the central nervous system and the heart. If carbon dioxide concentrations begin to rise, the pH of the blood would begin to decrease and become more acidic. Our body would recognize this drop in pH and trigger a feedback loop that increases respiration to try to eliminate the excess carbon dioxide. Major medical implications occur when there's improper ventilation of the lungs because it can lead to deadly consequences. While all proteins are subject to pH changes, the hemoglobin protein in our red blood cells is very sensitive to pH shifts. Hemoglobin is the protein that binds oxygen in our red blood cells, and when the pH changes a mere 0.2 of a point, these proteins become significantly less effective at carrying oxygen. So what does all this mean? Well, if carbon dioxide concentrations increase inside of our blood, this will lead to a decrease in pH, which then can lead to red blood cells being less capable of delivering oxygen to our cellular tissues. One really important thing to mention that students often get confused about is that although we're talking about CO2 concentrations influencing pH, oxygen concentrations do not do the same. Having high or low oxygen concentrations is not going to change your pH dynamically, like changing the concentrations of carbon dioxide would. Okay, so all of that was basic respiration, but what about the transport system working in the background of all of these organisms? Regardless of the system or the organism that we're talking about, the most common components to include inside of a circulatory system is a fluid that's capable of suspending nutrients and gases, as well as a passageway of vessels to direct it out to the tissues. The third component necessary would be a pump to move that fluid through those vessels around the body. Our blood serves as a pretty good example of a typical circulatory fluid. Most of our blood is a fluid called plasma that in itself is mostly water. The remaining part of our blood involves red blood cells for oxygen transport, white blood cells for immune system protection, and platelets to clot damaged vessels. Technically speaking, there are all sorts of cool white blood cells, and plasma also contains other components like protein and other essential ions. But that's kind of a conversation we'll have to have in a future discussion. Vessel structures in circulatory systems come in two main varieties. The first is called an open circulatory system. In this type of system, there are primary vessels that direct the bulk of fluid flow, but there are not tiny capillaries for direct diffusion from vessels to cells. Instead, the circulatory fluid is dumped onto the tissues for gas exchange to occur from blood to the inside of the cells. In contrast to this system, a closed circulatory system has vessels that direct all of the circulatory fluid to specific cells, and diffusion occurs out of the vessels into fluid around the tissues, ultimately ending with diffusion from this interstitial fluid into the cells. This is the most common type of circulatory system and matches our own. The pump to drive the entire process has been modified throughout evolution, but the primary adaptation that exists is having either multiple pumps or having multiple chambers in the same pump. Interestingly, it's thought that a 4-chambered heart actually evolved more than once throughout evolutionary history. This really is a testament to the effectiveness of this particular structure. One of the most simplistic systems we have as an example would be the circulatory system of fish. The heart of the fish is divided into just 2 chambers. Blood flowing into the heart is deoxygenated and needs to visit the gills to pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. Unfortunately, with this design, pressure from the gill capillaries is quite low, so fish must utilize muscles outside of the heart to aid in pushing blood throughout the tissues. Amphibians improve on this design by adding an additional chamber to function as a pump out to the body. While this is definitely a noticeable improvement, it is not without limitations, of which the primary one is that deoxygenated and oxygenated blood mix inside of the ventricle that sends blood out to the body for gas exchange and to the respiratory system to pick up oxygen. This mixing of blood makes the system less efficient. Fortunately for these organisms, gas exchange occurs across the skin as well, so these critters are able to thrive despite the limitation. The next step in evolutionary adaptation is to develop one pump with 4 chambers. In this design, one chamber is dedicated to receiving blood from the body, another is dedicated to sending it out to the lungs, while another receives blood from the lungs, and then the last chamber sends that blood out to the body. This system enables the heart to effectively maintain pressure throughout the vascular system and prevent blood from mixing that would reduce efficiency. This is exactly how your heart works. Before we start to get into the vessels that branch off of this amazing pump, keep in mind this general rule for the chambers of your heart. On the superior side, the top side, you have atriums that receive blood. And on the inferior side, or on the bottom side, you have ventricles that send blood out and away from the body. So atriums will always receive blood, and ventricles will always send it. As we exit the heart, vessels heading out to the lungs and the body begin as large structures with thick walls called arteries. Arteries eventually taper down into smaller vessels called arterioles. Once at the tissues, these arterioles will expand into very thin dispersed vessels called capillaries. Gas and nutrient exchange occurs from these capillaries into the interstitial fluid. Blood leaving the tissues then gets picked up by the venules that travel up towards the heart to merge with larger vessels called veins. In general, arteries have thicker walls because they encounter faster moving blood with higher pressures. Additionally, surface area is maximized in the capillaries for diffusion and transport out of the vessels into the tissues. So when we look collectively at our circulatory system and respiratory system, we can see a crazy cool method of moving nutrients and gas around to our cells. Keep in mind that the picture you see now is just a glimpse at the complexities showing only the primary arteries and veins. The actual vascular system is much, much more detailed. Alright all, that is it for this introduction to diversity of circulatory and respiratory systems. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to never miss another discussion. Additionally, if you want to go into any more detail of any of these systems, drop me a comment in the comment section below, and we'll have another conversation that delves deeper. As always, thank you all for watching, and see y'all next time.